Hello, and welcome to the Russian invasion of Ukraine Teach Out live town hall. My name is Jenny Patterson, and I'm a design manager at the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. This Teach Out brings together a number of experts in academia, in practice, and in the community who provide us important context and history about Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This Teach Out is still live on Coursera. Please jump in and engage with our community of global learners. You can find the link in the chat now. I want to thank everyone who has already submitted questions in the Teach Out and in the event registration. During this live session today, we invite you to submit additional questions for our panelists in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Given our limited time, we ask that you keep your questions related to the topic. Feel free to upload the questions you'd like to have answered by using the thumbs up icon in the Q&A section. As we bring together this diverse community in discussion, we ask that you be respectful of our speakers and other learners as you engage with this event and the Teach Out. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be emailed out to attendees after the event. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. Please feel free to start your videos. We have Eugene Bondarenko, a lecturer in Ukrainian Language and Culture at the University of Michigan. He's a former journalist and translator whose academic focus is on Ukrainian language, politics, as well as modern Ukrainian culture. We have Ambassador Melvyn Levitsky, a professor of international policy and practice at the Gerald R. School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He's a former U.S. diplomat who served in multiple roles during his 35-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, including ambassador to Brazil, ambassador to Bulgaria, and various roles within the former Soviet Union. We also have Jenna, who is a returned Peace Corps volunteer. She served in Ukraine from 2011 to 2013. Thank you all for joining us today. To kick us off, Russia's invasion into Ukraine has progressed significantly since our Teach Out first launched 3 weeks ago on March 4th. Melvyn, can you summarize what's happened in Ukraine over these last 3 weeks or so and describe the current status of the war?
Sure. Yeah, I see I'm on. I'm just checking. Well, yes, for one thing, what Putin thought would be a kind of roll through Ukraine and supported by some Ukrainians turned out to be a bad assessment. There's been significant resistance by Ukrainian forces. Putin's sense that, this kind of, I would almost a psychotic sense that they're brothers, but there's some bad actors. He calls them fascists and Nazis. They have a Jewish prime minister. All kinds of assessments that are in Putin's mind, and I shouldn't say just Putin, but also the leadership, the oligarchs, the people around him, made a very bad assessment of what the reaction would be. You can say that it was somewhat like when we went into Iraq, that we would be welcomed like victors. The thing is, there is a Ukrainian nationalism, which is, sure, Ukrainians are Slavs, but they have their own sense of destiny. They have their own sense of history. And it is, although, let's say, Kievan Rus, the Russian Empire, started essentially in Ukraine, it's a separate history. It's a separate collective memory. And when you go into a country that has that kind of attitude and with huge force, the fact is that they're fighting for their own homeland gives them an added incentive. And you're sending soldiers in and others in who are not from the area, presumably. Most of them aren't. That's Russian doctrine. So it's become quite I would say, a defensive standoff, but now it's becoming offensive. An area in which Ukrainians are now taking back some areas. So, it reminds me of what Colin Powell used to say about getting involved. It's the what they call the Pottery Barns, the Pottery Barn slogan, if you break it, it's yours. In other words, when you go in, and if your sense is that you're going to rule that country and the country doesn't want to be ruled, you've broken it and it's yours and you're going to have trouble. So I think this is an indication of what might happen if, frankly, if Putin tries to go in with major force, which could happen since they're much stronger than Ukrainian forces. Then what happens the day after? Is it going to be a peaceful rule of some kind with a puppet government? So all these things have indicated to me that exactly the opposite is happening from what Putin's and the leadership's goals were to begin with. Plus, they now have a reputation, Russia now has a reputation of being not only a strong country, the objective of being looked at as a major country equal to the United States and, let's say, the European Union is exactly been, that image has been violated. Russia is now looked on as a kind of international outlaw. They've broken the UN Charter of obligations. They've broken just about every international legal treaty. So they've gotten themselves in a mess. The question now is how this resolves itself. Will there be a negotiation that allows all countries to at least have part of their national interest resolved? And let me stop with that and let the others talk.
Yeah, Melvyn, I think that was a really great summary, and I think it does bring up just a lot of more questions from people. You know, what's next, and also a lot of questions of like, why did we get here in the first place, or how did we get here in the first place? Eugene, we saw indeed a lot of questions coming in asking about why. So, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Did or does Russia have any legitimate reasons for invading? So, can you speak to some of the historical context for why Russian President Putin may have made the decision to invade Ukraine?
Microphone.
Gotcha. Yep. Sorry, to answer that question right off the bat, you know, there are very few legitimate reasons why one might invade a neighboring country in a war of aggression. Wars of aggression in and of themselves are considered a violation of the rules of war. But the history behind it is this. It's very important to contextualize this in a colonial, colonized peoples versus colonizer kind of framework. Because the fact is that for the last 300 years or so, since 1648, the Ukrainian, well, what is modern Ukraine, has been colonized by various powers, but for the past 100 years, or predominantly by Russia or the Soviet Union. And, you know, I'm going to have a very rare moment where I agree with Mr. Putin in that, well, the Soviet Union was Russia by a different name, right? If you look at the history of Ukrainians under Soviet rule, there is, first of all, a concerted effort after the 1920s to basically Russify Ukrainians, which means for them to practice Russian culture, speak the Russian language, and things like this. To give you an idea of just how salient this was, even though my family has been Ukrainian speaking since before we can trace, I am in fact the first person to actually receive a formal education in Ukrainian. The reasons for the invasion are largely irredentist, right? So it is the refusal by the Kremlin leadership to accept the fact that Ukraine, since independence, has developed, or rather finished developing, a solid national and state identity. To give you an idea, you know, we oftentimes get confused as to how much influence people that lived in the Soviet Union have in Ukraine, right? So how much of that old Soviet memory. I'm in my mid-30s. People my age do not remember the Soviet Union in any meaningful way, right? This means that not only is about half of the Russian population and the Ukrainian population viewing this entirely differently from their parents, it also actually results in a a serious miscalculation by the Russian ruling class, right? First of all, to invade, because they believed that there would be some popular support for this, because maybe 30 years ago, this was the same country, and so why not? But part of this, actually a major reason, a lot of people talk about all of the Russian military failings at the beginning of the war. Why was it so poorly planned? Why did they think they were just going to walk in? Well, the answer is yes, you underestimate your enemy, but why? Because the Russian ruling class has refused to accept, and we see now that not just publicly, but internally, has refused to accept the notion that Ukrainians are equals, in the sense that if their country is going to get invaded, they would fight just as hard as anyone else to prevent this from happening. It should be noted that less than 100 years ago, between the years 1932 and 1933, there was a genocide carried out against Ukrainians called the Holodomor by the Soviet state. The legacy of genocide that is not within living memory anymore, but was, for quite a bit of my lifetime and certainly my parents' lifetime, there is no option to surrender, right? There is an understanding in the Ukrainian society that if Ukraine surrenders, Russia will once again commit genocide, and therefore that's why you see them fighting so hard. And I want to second what Ambassador Levitsky said, that yeah, Putin does not seem to have any game plan, even if he somehow manages to pull off a military operation and succeed, which is, by the way, I have my doubts about this. Russia's only functioning tank plant stopped running yesterday because they're missing key components, which were actually German engines and high-end electronics from Europe, which shouldn't have been sold there in the first place, but that's a different story. So I don't believe, so yes, to answer it shortly, I think one of the major reasons is the refusal by the Russian leadership to really view Ukrainians as equals. And underestimating your enemy is a great way to lose a war. Hope that answers the question. As far as the legitimacy of wanting to invade it,
Thanks, Eugene.
no.
Jen, I see you have your hand up. Was there more you wanted to add there?
Okay, yeah, so I do agree with both of them about just the invasion part of Russia's invasion and the aggression that they have shown towards Ukraine, as mentioned during the Holodomor, which was a great famine run by Stalin. That, and in addition to the treatment by Russians of Ukraine's over, like he mentioned, 100 years. So, but I did want to touch on the NATO piece, because some people have said that for Russia, Ukraine joining NATO was a red line. So I just wanted to start out, NATO and Ukraine started relations in 1992, after Ukraine was gained independence from the Soviet Union. Ukraine did join the North Atlantic Partnership Council. And even throughout, until now, American presidents have supported Ukraine to join NATO on and off. So in 2005, George Bush wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. France and Germany opposed that. In 2008, there was again a promise to one day join NATO. And now in 2014, the Ukrainian people started wanting to join NATO, because that is when Russia initially invaded Ukraine. Don't forget that in 2014, this is when the aggression started. Ukraine had a president who completely denied the people's request to go towards the European Union. And in 2014, So that protest was peaceful at first. It started in 2013. They disagreed with Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, because he went towards Moscow instead of going towards the European Union, which the people wanted. And slowly but surely, Yanukovych started to crack down on these peaceful protests with violence. And when people started dying because of this crackdown, that's when the protest became an overthrow, and the people of Ukraine overthrew Yanukovych. He fled, he went to Russia, and that's when we had the Poroshenko, or when they had Poroshenko elected, and that's when Russia initially invaded, took over Crimea, took up arms in Crimea, forced people to vote for a Russian independence with Crimea, which was forced by knocking on doors with machine guns and telling people how they had to vote. So this fake election in Crimea was how Russia initially started their aggression towards Ukraine. Then the fake puppet Donbas People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic started in the east of Ukraine, which basically was Russian military pretending like they weren't there. And that led to, in 2019, when the Russian military shot down the passenger airline that killed 298 people. Well, starting in 2014 until today, 14,000 Ukrainian people have died defending the East, defending their land against Russian aggression. So I just want to say that, you know, NATO has been a talking piece for a long time, and it's not a cause or a red line for Russia, in my opinion, because they've been talking about it over many years. And for Russia to pretend like, oh, now they want to join NATO is sort of a false narrative in itself. In addition to other Russian reasons, the other reasons that Putin says, like, oh, Ukraine has Nazis and they're committing genocide, which is completely false and unfounded by the international community. There's no evidence of genocide happening. So it's just one lie after another for Putin's personal gain, for his dream of reuniting the Soviet Union, or even to reunite the Russian Empire under like a Tsar type of system. So in my opinion, now in 2021, last year, NATO was brought on the table once again. And I think it was just for Ukraine's defense, and Russia used as an excuse, in my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. We actually got a number of questions asking about NATO and its relationship with Ukraine. Mel, I wonder if you can speak to Ukraine's general relationship with NATO. Jenna, you brought up a number of points there, historical points there, but I guess, can we clarify, like, did Ukraine apply to NATO to join NATO in the past? And if they were interested in joining NATO in the past, why didn't that happen? And can they join NATO now, even as they're being invaded?
Well, let's make sure I'm being heard. Yeah, okay. Look, the position has been pretty clear that Ukraine does not meet the qualifications to enter NATO right now. So let's say the U.S. position has been, we are not pushing at this point, because it would be foolish to do that and create even more fractious relationships right now at the time when we have military conflict going on. That's been made very clear. It's not going to happen. It wouldn't happen right away. But the other side of that position is that, and from the standpoint of ourselves and NATO, and frankly, from the standpoint of international law, a country, a nation should have the right to choose who its friends are, who its allies are, who its economic allies are, and in a case of, let's say, a military defensive organization like NATO, who its partners are. In fact, let's remember that there was a NATO-Russia dialogue over a long period of time. NATO invited Russia, and there was a representation of Russia in NATO headquarters for a dialogue to make sure that well, let me put it a different way. We think back, there's a slogan that I always think of, even paranoids have enemies. So you could understand Russia at the end, as the Soviet Union breaks up and it sees these countries, you have to take their viewpoint into account as well. And you see these countries that were parts of the Soviet Union or forced allies in the Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union, striving for freedom, looking to the West from the standpoint of economic and political support. And Russia, even paranoids have enemies, sees this as an encirclement. That has to be really taken into account. As a former diplomat, if I were negotiating this, and I think that's probably the way things are happening, I have to take into account what our interests are, what Russia's interests are, see if there are parallel interests that we can agree on in the beginning, and then expand it into dealing with those issues of conflict. And I think there are ways, it's a little bit late now given a military intervention, but there would be ways to, for example, that the Ukrainian leadership could guarantee somewhat more autonomy to those areas that the Russians now have said or should be independent countries. It's gone a little too far, I think, at this point to have that happen. But if the continued defensive stance by the Ukrainians, which has stopped the Russian advance, continues, it's going to put the Russians into a position of saying, well, maybe we ought to try to find a way out in which we can say we served our interests in some way. Put that all together. Again, as a diplomat, I could construct this, on a board or something like that. The question is, we're dealing with real life people. So sometimes motivations, in fact, I think Putin has to worry about his continued leadership if he gets, as he has gotten Russia into a real jam. That is pottery barn. You break it, it's yours. And they seem to be in a real jam now in terms of their commitment, in terms of the losses that they've taken. So there may be at some point an entry for some kind of diplomatic solution. It's not there yet right now. But again, as I say, in my experience in dealing with negotiations, I could see something being put together. It's just the timing right now is not possible when you have an active intervention. You'd have to have a ceasefire in place, one, and then a dialogue. The Ukrainians actually had a kind of agreement that there might be a ceasefire, and then it was broken. So, as I say, in the future, there may be some solution to this, a diplomatic solution, but the actual conflict has to stop. And there has to be a ceasefire of some kind, so that the parties can have a negotiation among themselves. Sorry, that's a long answer, I know, but it's a very complicated situation.
No, thank you. That was really insightful. Eugene, what would you like to add?
Just, I would actually, first of all, I agree with the vast majority of what the ambassador said, and clearly his experience with diplomacy is so much greater than mine that it's not even worth comparing. However, I would like to just sort of ask a few rhetorical, ethical questions here, right? And is this in the sense that Russia's interests certainly need to be considered to the extent that what will get them to the negotiating table. But I want to be extra clear about this being real, that I believe that this only needs to be done in a realpolitik kind of way, right? Where to get a particular outcome, you have to talk to them. If we're talking about the legitimacy of these concerns, right? I really want to push back on this. NATO has included a lot more Eastern members lately. The vast majority of those members have been invaded or had a puppet regime pushed on them by the USSR over the last 70 years. Wanting to join NATO, if you're an East European country close to Russia, is actually a fairly logical point of view, because as my Ukrainian friends and I joke, if we could have taken the country and rowed it out to the middle of the Pacific, we would have done so a long time ago. But this is Ukraine's neighborhood, and this is what they have to contend with. In terms of the you know, and I just want to point this out, that I really want us to make sure that we are, and I'm sure that the ambassador probably, or perhaps I believe the ambassador had this in mind, is that these are things we need to do to attempt to stop the war. This is not something that we need to inform our thinking about who is the victim and who is the aggressor here, right? And that's all I wanted to add.
Mel, do you want to respond?
Yes, am I being heard? Yeah. No, I agree with this. What I'm saying from the standpoint of, you know, I think the main thing now is just, if we think of it from a human standpoint, we want to stop the killing. So a ceasefire in place, even with the Russians occupying that part that they've taken, is a first step toward getting an equitable solution that would deal with the, absolutely right, the moral question, and the question of international law, and the question of a UN member violating the UN Charter by trying to impose its will by force on a neighboring country. You know, why wouldn't the Russians have support for this worldwide? You know, actually, they have a lot of allies around the world. They've done some things that brought them friends, because there are so many countries around the world that have nasty neighbors, for one thing. And if the principle of imposing a country's will on another country, a powerful country on a less powerful country, we're going to have international chaos. So Russia will have very little support on this, except for, you know, Belarus, natural, right? Because they're dependent. I mean, it's like they were a satellite country in the old days. But we have to get to a point where we can begin to understand the Russians' viewpoint, even if it's illegitimate, so that we can get a settlement to stop the fighting, get Russia out of there, ensure Ukraine's independence. And it's a real politic, but it's also a moral issue as well, in terms of the lives that are being lost, the property that's being destroyed, the civilians that are being killed. After all, this is not just combatants being killed, you know, which happens in war, but the civilians, you know, kids, or people hunkered down in the subways. Think of the damage that it's doing also to children who are taken by families away from their homes, made into refugees, living in areas underneath the ground. So my sense is, yeah, realpolitik. The end is both a political end and a moral solution as well, and we have to take that into account. I agree completely with Eugene on this. I mean, it's more than just realpolitik, but realpolitik and techniques of negotiation that tend to be less moral, in the sense of, you know, you have to stand up to the standard or something like that. We can get to a solution. It will be an advance for morality as well. That's my point.
Jenna, was there? Jenna, was there more that you wanted to?
Well, I agree with them that yes, Russia is the aggressor. They're killing civilians, children, bombing maternity hospitals, even bombing places where Ukrainians have tried to write children on the ground so that they don't bomb them. And still those places are being targeted. So to try to come to a perspective of Putin's perspective on what he wants and what's going to make him stop, I'm not really sure. To me, he seems like a bully, and a bully might be stopped by applying pressure and more aggression towards that bully to make him back down, such as closing the skies or getting NATO involved or creating a World War III, which is not something that people would want to do, because it would cause more destruction and more deaths. So at this point, it's very likely that the oligarchs and Putin's inner circle might be pressuring him, or they might want him out if they disagree. So there's no insight into that from my perspective. But if that could happen, that might be a way for the oligarchs to save face and put another president in power instead of Putin, and put, and just try to fine Putin for the damage that he's caused, take his money, repay the Ukrainians, and start fresh with a new Russian leadership that can basically repair their economy and save face for them. That's sort of one solution that I could see, but of course I don't have insight into that, and I'm just guessing and dreaming that this could end. So that would probably quickly end it, especially if the sanctions keep going. And that is something that Ukraine can use now as a piece to argue, just a political piece to argue for peace, to stop the killing. Is if you don't stop, you're going to ruin your economy. And hopefully when oligarchs and people in power hear that, they'll be afraid to, to support Putin any longer. That's just my take.
Thank you, Jenna. We'll have Mel respond, and then we'll start answering some of our questions that came up in the Q&A.
Yeah, I don't. I just wanted to make a comment about historical memory, which is important in a context like this. And then we'll go into the questions. But let me just say one thing: historical memory. Think of Ukraine during the Stalin period. Collectivization, confiscation, starvation, millions of people dying. In the Second World War, there was a significant amount of collaboration between some Ukrainians and the Nazis advancing across Ukraine into the Soviet Union. Why? Because that historical, remember, you're talking about the 40s now. This is only some, 20 years or so after the Stalin starved out and killed by his campaigns millions of Ukrainians. So you could understand why Ukraine at the time, and some Ukrainians would want to get out of the so-called Soviet yoke over, on them. So there was some collaboration, not significant in terms of numbers, but some, hoping that would free them from the Soviet Union. So that's something to understand in the Russian mind as well, right? In the Ukrainian mind, there's that. They have the collective memory of going back to that. And then they have the memory of the war. A lot of controversy about some who supported, some who didn't. This idea that the Nazi, that Putin continues to push this fascist Nazi issue that he's talking about is a way to kind of gin up public opinion in his support in Russia, at least. But going back into history, there's a basis for saying that. No longer, I think. So we need to keep this into account. I remember, for example, I'll just give you a personal example about suspicion. and I'm talking about the 70s, when I served at the embassy in Moscow as a junior, well, a middle-range diplomat. When I went to Ukraine, we would take travel. We wanted to go around, test the pulse, see if we could talk with people. One of my issues was Soviet Jewish immigration, which was a big issue at the time because of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which tied immigration to normal trade relations. When I went to Ukraine, I never was followed as closely as going to Ukraine. There was this suspicion. The KGB, whatever they were, on my tail whenever I just walk around the city, wanted to go see the monument, the Babi Yar monument, or I would go to the synagogue. I'm Jewish, so I would go to see, see what the synagogue was like, and even participate in the service and that kind of thing. It was almost on my tail all the time, much more so than in Moscow. So it gave me a sense that this kind of suspicion was very intense on the Russian part with regard to Ukraine. And I think that is a carryover, but it's something we need to take into account when we're trying to assess how we can help get out of this situation where people are being killed and civilians are being killed. I just wanted to make that comment in terms of that, thinking about historical memory and what that does to policy today, even though it happened 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, et cetera. Thanks.
Thanks, Mel. I'm gonna, Eugene, I see your hand raised. I'm gonna ask you one of our questions that came into the Q&A, but if you want to briefly respond to Mel's comment here, as you begin answering that question, that's
actually, I just have
great.
like a little, it's a 20-second response at most. So if I can just really quickly, because I actually don't
Sure.
disagree with anything that the ambassador said. I simply want to just give a few percentage points for this. So to put this in a numerical context, during World War II, right, as everywhere else, there was collaboration with the Nazis as well as resistance to the Nazis, both in Ukraine and everywhere else. Ukraine has, so first of all, this percentage of the population that engaged in this nowhere is over about 3%, right, on both ends. So we have only about 3% actively doing something against, about 3% actively doing something for. In Ukraine's case, you have quite a large number of collaborators, but you also paradoxically have a much larger than average number of resistors, or so-called righteous Gentiles, as they're labeled by the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Center. So yes, this is definitely a very fraught part of history. However, I do want to, as an illustration, also point out that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, who I, by the way, don't any longer have to introduce and explain, which made my life a lot easier, he is himself Jewish, and he was elected with 70% of the vote. So does having, a Jewish president mean there's no anti-Semitism? No, absolutely not. We, just like having a Black president in the United States doesn't mean that racism is dead, right? But but still, it is a particular litmus test that at least for 70% of society, his ethnicity was not, at least not important, if not consequential whatsoever. That's my answer to, that's just what I wanted to add to the ambassador's statement.
Thank you, Eugene. One of the questions that we'd like to ask you to answer, one that came in the chat, is could you speak in more detail about how Putin is justifying the invasion to the Russian people, and even on an emotional level? So he speaks about protecting Russian speakers that are oppressed by the current Ukrainian government. For example, crimes committed against Russian speakers aren't being prosecuted. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that, well, actually, the largest crimes committed against Russian speakers in the history of Ukraine in the last 100 years are the siege of Mariupol by the Russian forces, which Mariupol is, in case the audience is not familiar, is about 95% Russian speaking, as is Kharkiv, as is Sumy is a little bit less so, but all of the major cities, with the exception of Kiev, that are right now seeing combat are predominantly Russian speaking. So the notion that he's there to protect Russians doesn't really hold up a whole lot of water. On top of that, let me just be clear here. In Ukraine, the bar for citizenship is not ethnicity, it's not linguistic knowledge, is were you born in Ukraine? Automatic citizenship, right? Ukraine is not an ethnic state either by law or by ideology, right? Now, this has been a shift that occurred within the last 30 years, particularly in 2014 was where we saw the emergence of a Ukrainian civic identity that is completely independent of a Ukrainian ethnic identity, right? Right, when we talk about Putin defending Russian speakers, there isn't much of anything to be said here. When we talk about, Putin does talk about Nazis a lot, right? Because Nazis are bad, rightfully so, and it's very easy to, if you can associate your opponents with Nazis, you can justify doing all sorts of awful things to them, right? However, what is actually meant by this, I would argue that for the Russian public, this is what is known as a dog whistle in American politics, right? This is where you say something that is one thing, but actually the subtext to a lot of your base is something different, right? When Putin talks about denazifying, what he is actually hitting on is what I alluded to earlier, is this pretty widespread belief in Russian society, and especially in the ruling class, that Ukrainians are less than, that any kind of Ukrainian national identity is actually a foreign plot to try to split Russia, right? Because naturally Ukraine is, in their worldview, part of Russia. Is there a far right in Ukraine? Yeah, absolutely, just like there is a far right everywhere else. Is it represented in parliament? Not more so than here. In the United States, right? I mean, yes, there are a few MPs, but there are no nationalist parties in parliament currently, right? While I don't want to completely say, oh no, Nazism and fascism don't exist in Ukraine, period. That's not true of any country. But the argument that Ukraine is somehow a fascist state, I mean, look, Ukraine has had more presidents and more elections than Russia and Belarus combined over the last 30 years, right? I mean, if you want to talk about a level of democratic and civic engagement, which is generally not a hallmark of fascist societies, this would be a pretty strong indicator. In terms of demilitarization, I mean, look, if there's any country on earth right now that I think is pretty much justified in having a very strong military, Ukraine is it. Right, it's absolutely ludicrous to talk about we're going to demilitarize you, and in order to make sure that we're going to invade you. I mean, obviously the logical response by any state would be to arm up even more, right? The way that it's being justified to the Russian public is largely through this denazification dog whistle, because saving Russian speakers doesn't really work on a lot of folks because they've been to Ukraine in their lives, right? And they know that Kharkiv is Russian speaking. They know that Mariupol is Russian speaking. I don't think that that's swaying too many people. And demilitarization, I don't actually think that figures into, they might use it to try to sell it, to try to portray Ukraine as a threat, right? But I mean, to portray Ukraine as a threat to Russia, it really takes a lot of mental gymnastics. Yeah, I really think that it's this main dog whistle of denazification, which really means committing ethnocide, genocide against Ukrainians. That is what is keeping the Russian public in line.
Jen, I see your hand raised. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, so my husband is Ukrainian and I served in the Peace Corps 2011 to 2013. So we have a lot of friends there. Those friends and family there, they have family in Russia. They have reached out to their Russian family on the phone to call them and talk to them about the war. In addition, my sister-in-law has family in Belarus, who she's called to talk to. According to those conversations, they said that Ukraine are Nazis, and we will come and shoot you on the street and destroy the Nazis in Ukraine. This level of brainwashing is accomplished through media, through social media, through, you know, just basic like conspiracy theory propagating propaganda. So if family members of Ukrainians are saying this stuff, you know, I have only a couple instances. It just makes you think that a majority of people, if they're uneducated, if they've lived their whole life isolated in a village, or they don't have many resources, or they have one type of media channel, only a TV, then it's happening, it's brainwashing. And that's sort of, you know, Putin's MO is to brainwash people, like Eugene mentioned the dog whistle theory. So they get a story, a little bit of truth, like I've heard this Azov battalion is Nazis and extremists. And so while they do have practices that are bad, that is not the majority of Ukrainians. And when Russia tries to justify an invasion based on a very small minority of one instance that occurred, that's not even killing people. These white supremacist groups are far-right extremists. Okay, they're not killing people, they're not creating a genocide. That is not a reason to invade. But the way that it's being communicated to the people in Russia through media, through propaganda, is that those people are killing. They're killing Russians. And so how do you create a mass support for your unjustified war? You lie. You say a small truth coded in a lie, coded in exaggeration, coded in all these false pretenses that Putin has said to justify his invasion. So that's what my take is that people are being manipulated and brainwashed. And it's really sad because it's ripping families apart. There's families of, so mothers, Ukrainian mothers have sons and daughters that are in Russia that have been forced to join the army, and now they have to go and fight their mothers in Ukraine. So you've heard the stories. Russian army have been captured by Ukrainians. They've been allowed tea, hot meals, cell phone use. They've been able to text their mothers. They've been able to talk to their mothers. And that is what's happening. So Russian military, like the people who are more innocent than other Russian military people, the younger, I would say like 18, 19-year-old Russian army people that are coming in, they realize when they get here that there's no killings. They're not welcoming us with flowers. This is not what Putin told us. We didn't come here for an exercise. This is an all-out war. So you do have instances of the Russian army coming to Ukraine and becoming enlightened and deserting their posts, deserting their tanks. So it just goes to show you that manipulation and brainwashing can only go so far. So yeah, I don't think Putin's strategy with winning the hearts and minds is ever going to work. So that's just my take. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that, Jenna. We have just about 5 minutes left. So Eugene, I'll let you respond. And then Mel, I might circle back to you for some final thoughts.
So I just wanted to add one thing about what Jenna said. As a Ukrainian, I have a very difficult time differentiating between any kind of Russian soldier. If they're in Ukraine with a weapon, they're in Ukraine with a weapon. At the end of the day, though, I do want to say that being sent to Ukraine as a Russian soldier does not actually absolve said soldier of any responsibility. When someone gives you a gun, you always have a choice. It's a brutal reality, but it's true. With a gun in your hands, you have a choice. I'm not saying that it's one or the other, but I'm saying that you certainly have a choice not to shoot your enemy with it or your proposed enemy with it. So aside from the Russian soldiers who voluntarily surrendered or were taken prisoner, which naturally we have rules for how POWs are dealt with, right? And those should be followed without exception. However, I do push back on the notion that there's varying levels of culpability. Once you cross a border with a gun, you've crossed the border with a gun. And you have to remember that to the people living there, nobody cares whether you wanted to or not. If you're shooting at them, you're shooting at them. That's the hard reality.
Yes,
A
I
hard
agree.
reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's the thing too, is that no matter what, they are still military Russian and they're invading Ukraine, and Ukraine has every right to defend themselves and to push back and to fight. So I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Eugene and Jenna, for those great points. Mel, final thoughts from you? Anything you want to share? Last thoughts you want to share with our learners here today?
Sure. Well, again, there are so many issues involved here. Morality, international law, realpolitik. The goal should be to stop in place, stop the killing, stop the fighting, and see if something can be worked out. And it may not be an exactly moral solution. Morality is important, but sometimes in diplomacy, morality gets pushed to the side in the sense of trying to match national interests so that the conflict itself can be stopped. Because what's the most important thing here is not national identity. It's the fact that people are being killed daily on both sides. And this question of, well, I'm a Russian soldier. I'm being ordered to do it. I have to do that. That was also a question in every war we've had in the Second World War too. Well, I was under orders. I had to do this. I had to push people into the ovens because I was ordered to do this. And can there are a lot of people that have looked at this and said, when you're involved in a regime that it's a kind of moving train and you can't get off it, you're in there. The morality sometimes on the part of the people concerned passes aside, and that's why you have, you're a soldier, you've got a weapon, as Eugene said, don't use it. That sort of doesn't occur when you're involved in that, because it's this train that's moving on, ever moving forward. It's difficult for a soldier to say, I'm going to disobey orders. However, my sense is, look, we have to find a practical way of stopping the killing, getting back to the negotiating table, and let the Russians and the Ukrainians work out some kind of means so that there won't be another invasion by the Russians. The Russians have already suffered because Russia, not the Russians, but Russia itself in terms of reputation has already suffered because it's become an international outlaw country, completely outside international law in terms of what they've done. So if Russia wants to return to being at least a kind of respected country, they're going to have to find a way out of it themselves. What are they going to do? Occupy Ukraine, put in a puppet government? Who's going to accept that? Countries aren't going to say, well, okay, now it's a legitimate government and yeah, it's pro-Russian. No, that's not going to happen if it's installed via military means. So I don't have a solution for this. What I would do as a, just thinking of it in diplomatic terms is, let's stop the fighting. Let's get a ceasefire. Let's have some negotiation. Let's try to find a way that this doesn't happen again. And let's also preserve the ability of Ukraine to choose its own allies and friends, but not necessarily move forward in the sense of the United States interest, let's say, to get Ukraine into NATO right away. We can say that's a legitimate aspiration, but putting more sparks and more wood into the fire would not be a good idea at this particular time. We need to stop it, stop the killing, and have some diplomacy applied to what is a very difficult situation. That's hard to do, but that should certainly be a goal. Stop people from being killed, stop innocent children from having their minds affected by living in subways over a period of time, moving away into Poland, away from their friends or wherever it is. This is going to have think about the effect it would have on small children to be uprooted like that, refugees in another country, leaving their friends, leaving their schools. This is traumatic experience for those kids. That's the reason why I think the goal should be, let's try to stop it, get a ceasefire, and then so we can move back to at least the normal situation for those thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that have been affected, refugees. Who wants to be a refugee in another country? No matter how accommodating the Poles have been, and they've done a magnificent job of accepting tens of thousands of people, it's still a false existence for those refugees. And we need to help try to get them back to a normal life. And that's what diplomacy can do. It's hard work. It requires some flexibility on all sides, including NATO, including the Russians, if we can get there, and including the mixed Ukrainian population. Let's remember, it's a country that has a variety of interests, a variety of different kinds of people, ethnic groups, etc. in it. So, I mean, it's a hard task, but that should be the goal. And from the standpoint of international law, we need to get this settled so that it doesn't provide an example of one country imposing its will on another country as becoming an accepted not an accepted standard, but an accepted way for a country's interest to be imposed. That would be there are so many conflicts around the world that would really be a terrible example if this were to go through. And that's what we need to work toward in the future, it seems to me. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers of this. It's been, I think, a terrific way for these various viewpoints to get through. So very much thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you, Mel, and thank you so much, Eugene and Jenna, as well as all the learners who joined us today. If you haven't already, please check out and share the Russian invasion of Ukraine teach out and live in Coursera. The link is in the chat here. I'll also note that we have over 40 other teach outs on Michigan Online that you can check out as well. Our content is available under Creative Commons license and can be reused and shared with credit. In addition to videos from our experts today and other content experts, in this teach out, we share a number of ways that we can all meaningfully support the people of Ukraine and those impacted by this conflict, from policy advocacy to direct contributions. So we hope to see you join. Thank you again for engaging in this discussion today, and take care.